Thank you very much indeed, Professor O'Dowd, for bringing women back into the equation as we approach the period of the decade 1912 to 1922. Our final speaker this evening is well known to many people in the audience and beyond. He's Mr. John Killen, librarian of Belfast's Linenhall Library, which has its roots in Belfast's golden age of the late 18th century, of the volunteers reflected in Mary O'Dowd's slide, but also, of course, the United Irishmen. And in fact, hopefully this fate doesn't befall John, but I think the second librarian was hanged for his part in Robert Emmet's rebellion in 1803. John Killen has been a prolific author over the years of valuable works in Irish history. He's looked at the United Irishmen, he's looked at the Great Famine, and he's looked in particular at the power of the political cartoon as we move into the era of Home Rule and the 1916 Rising. And that's what he's going to talk about this evening. John Killen.
As I say, I'm delighted to have been invited to speak tonight. I believe that the decade that we're looking at, this decade of centenaries, is a defining decade. It defined really the complete century, the 20th century in Ireland. And I would like to begin and say that Ireland has always been something of an enigma to the rest of the world. From Ptolemy's 2nd century cartographic representation of this Western Isle to the present day. But its inhabitants have always been very aware and had a real and intimate knowledge of all the nuances of our situation. We're entering a decade of centenaries. Now, as with all periods in history, life seldom fits neatly into encapsulated time frames. Academics who study the 18th century are aware of this. They have created for themselves what they call the long 18th century, which can begin as early as 1650 and end as late as 1825, simply because cause and effect need perspective. So too in the decade under discussion, events pre-1912 must be understood to allow us to assess their causal effect. Having said that, I believe that the events between 1912 and 1923 in Ireland defined the 20th century on this island and further afield. In 1900, the Parnellite and anti-Parnellite factions of the Irish Home Rule Party reunited under John Redmond. In 1905, Arthur Griffith founded the Sinn Féin movement with Bulmer Hobson, a northern Protestant nationalist. Their aim was to end British rule in Ireland, and their propaganda took many forms. The question was, what form would Irish independence take, and how would it be achieved? Would it be home rule? Would it be devolution? Would it be revolution? This Donald McGill postcard was rather risky at the time when it suggested that home rule was an active union that satisfied both parties. But in real terms, in real politics, women's rights were coming to the fore. The demand for women's suffrage was a burning issue of the day, and Irish suffragettes were determined that home rule would include votes for women. Their campaign, however, was stalled and almost subsumed in the defence of the political status quo. The strongly unionist province of Ulster was determined to resist home rule and had cogent and emotional arguments against it. To resist home rule and the threat of home rule, mass demonstrations were organised by Edward Carson, leader of the Unionist Party, culminating in the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant on the 29th of September 1912. Carson and Redmond were now at an impasse. But Carson knew that the issue would be settled at Westminster, where the third Home Rule Bill had only been deferred by the House of Lords. But for how long? The Irish Unionists needed a bargaining chip, and that bargaining chip was to be armed resistance. In April 1914, the Clyde Valley sailed into Bangor Harbour, and the newly formed Ulster Volunteer Force unloaded 100,000 rifles and ammunition for use in resisting the imposition of Home Rule for Ireland. Police searches for these arms produced no results. Ulster was now armed, but not to be outdone, Erskine Childers landed German arms at Host and distributed them to the newly formed Irish Volunteers. Now there were two armed camps in Ireland, one espousing Home Rule and one determined to oppose Home Rule. The mutiny at the Curragh, when British officers refused to take up arms against Ulster volunteers, was a major blow to Asquith's Home Rule Bill. The situation, though, was almost immediately changed when Britain declared war against Germany in August 1914. Redmond's call for Irish volunteers to enlist in the British Army was ridiculed by his more militant members of his party, who began to plan an armed uprising. In April 1916, Pearse, MacDonagh, Kent and others led an armed rebellion against English rule in Ireland. 3 months later, at the Somme, Ulster lost almost a complete generation of its young men. The Irish question had been shelved, it had not been resolved with the outbreak of the war. But in 1917, Lloyd George turned his attention to it and convened the Irish Convention. With Sinn Féin boycotting the talks and the war effort taking precedence in political thinking, no progress was made. Irish independence remained what Irish nationalists sought. American support was solicited from President Wilson, whose 14 points seemed to suggest self-government for small nations. Spurned by Wilson, Sinn Féin convened the first Dáil Éireann, and the War of Independence began. Lloyd George had once more reluctantly to address the Irish question. His answer was partition, a political expedient to placate two implacable and seemingly irreconcilable political positions. The caption of this Punch cartoon, I think, is telling. It has the Welsh wizard say, "I now proceed to cut this map in two parts and place them in the hat. After a suitable interval, they will be found to have come together again of their own accord." Aside, at least I hope so. I've never done this trick before. And so the island of Ireland was partitioned, and an experiment in political wizardry began. Partition became the physical symbol of a failure of the people of this island to live together harmoniously. At times, that symbol was confused with that underlying failure. When a boundary commission was convened in 1924, John Bull advises the President of Ireland. He says, "I don't see this as the best fence I've ever sat on, but if you hope one day to dispense with it altogether, I shouldn't raise too much trouble about it now." The workings of the Boundary Commission proved too complex for change. What also didn't change was the constant ideological war between unionism and nationalism in the north of Ireland, as exemplified by this 1936 cartoon in PTQ, titled "The Battle of York Street 1990, Prophetic," and this 1943 pamphlet describing from a nationalist point of view the political situation in Northern Ireland, entitled "The Partition of Ireland." Also, what didn't change was the ideological debate between physical force and the democratic process. Throughout the century, community regard for our respective police forces seemed to be one point of agreement. Attempts at reaching a political understanding, if not an accommodation between North and South, failed because of mutual distrust and possibly misunderstanding, allowing, in this Dublin opinion cartoon for 1950, for a fastening again on partition as the problem and not a symbol of the problem. Economic arguments extolling the benefits of both North and South of such initiatives as the Earn, Drainage and Development Bill, and increasing international exasperation failed to bring about a political dialogue. International influences throughout the century were superficial, if at times challenging. Not until the 1980s and into the 90s, would American influence be brought to bear on the Irish question with dramatic effect? When inter-community conflict broke out in Northern Ireland in 1968-69, London quoted the 17th century Irish dramatist George Farquhar. He said, "'Tis a strange thing that amongst us people can't agree the whole week because they go different ways on Sundays." And a new round of political talks began, which would see the old political arguments trotted out. Ulster politician after Ulster politician after Ulster politician failed to solve a problem that was masked in a symbol of a problem. And then came the efforts of successive secretaries of state to the same outcome, because it was now time to send in the heavy guns. And at last, in the latter part of the 20th century, an uneasy accommodation was reached. And now we enter into this decade of centenaries. The events of the years 1912 to 22, as I say, defined the history of Ireland in the 20th century. The material that will allow us to revisit that decade is in our public institutions, in the Ulster Museum, in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, in the National Library of Ireland, and in the Linenhall Library. In this decade of centenaries, I haven't even mentioned Titanic, Belfast and Derry's 400-year charter, the publication of Ulysses, its immediate banning in Ireland, and many other events. All merit and will receive public and academic scrutiny. Intellectual rigour will be essential to move our society forward. To me, one of the most, if not the most important anniversary in this decade is the 13th of May 2013, which is the 225th anniversary of the foundation of the Linenhall Library, which is truly an invaluable and essential part of our community archive. Ladies and gentlemen, the material you have seen has come from a very small part of our collections. It is essential, as is the material in the Record Office, the Ulster Museum, the National Library, for us to revisit, because we must only make up our minds from real contemporary material that will enlighten us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.